So, nice. All right. So, yes, still got people coming on. So I will let people in as we go. All right. So here we are. So ADHD, a guide for early years professionals. Now, before I move on, I reread this afternoon just to prepare, and I thought, do you know what? I don't really like this slide because the person on it looks really, really sad. And there's actually so much more to ADHD than feeling sad and overwhelmed. So I've changed it. And I think that's a really important first message to start with. Okay, really important. Whatever's going on in our heads, however busy our brains are, we are enough. Okay. But before we start, as you all know now, we have to go through a few housekeeping rules and a bit about our Stronger Practice Hub. So cameras on or off as usual. I do not mind. It's the evening time. We all like to be cozy, a little bit makeup off and in an hoodie. But please do keep yourself on mute at all times unless you're contributing to the Q&A at the end, because we don't want to be hearing any confidential setting or household conversations. Any questions, type them into the chat box. If you're anything like me, if you try and hold that thought, you'll forget it by the time you get to the end. So please pop it in if you have any thoughts as we go, and we'll review it all at the end. Come and go as you need. We've all got children at home, probably pets at home. We need cups of tea, glass of gin. Do what you need to do. Slides will be emailed to you, so please do not feel you need to make copious notes. As you all know by now, these webinars are hosted by our wonderful Reach Out Stronger Practice Hub team, which is made up of Damon, Victoria, Jess and Lisa. We're joined tonight, as ever, by our constants, Damon and Lisa. So thank you to them for joining us this evening as well. Stronger Practice Hubs were commissioned by the Department for Education as part of the COVID-19 early years recovery program, and their aim is to improve outcomes across the EYFS for children in the local area. So there are 18 Stronger Practice Hubs based around the UK, and our one is based at the Barn Nursery School in Grinstead Green. The Early Years Evidence Store is available to everybody working in early years. It's a website which has all the current evidence base for lots of different areas of the early years foundation stage. So as I usually say, if you are new to practice and you're kind of not really sure what you're doing and why, go and have a check on it. If you are a long-termer in practice, then it's always good to make sure that what you're doing is current evidence and not just done because that's the way we've always done it. So this is a really useful free resource for you to make sure you're up to date with the evidence base for that area of the curriculum in which you're interested. The Stronger Practice Hub also offers bespoke support because, as we know, childcare settings are not a one size fits all. So if there's something in particular that you need, please do get in touch with the Stronger Practice Hub and they will be able to put together a package of support for you. Some QR codes to keep in touch with us on our socials, where you can find out about all the childminder meetups, all the other webinars by other professionals, all of the things that they have to offer. All right, here's a sobering thought to get us going with. And as parents of ADHD children, when we saw this quote, we both had a little moment. It's estimated that those with ADHD receive 20,000 more negative messages by age 12 than those without the condition. And that's a really sobering thought, actually, because these children have very often been billed as naughty, inattentive, problematic. And actually, that's not the case. These kids are wonderful kids, and we need to know how to nurture them in the right way. So what is ADHD? ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. But what does that actually mean? It's part of our umbrella of neurodiversity, which you've probably all heard me talking about now. So it comes under the conditions such as ASD, developmental language disorder, dyslexia, dyscalculia, basically means that our brain works differently to the typical brain or the neurotypical brain. And that's not a bad thing. It's just a different thing. And that's what we really need to keep in mind. So I'm going to drill down a little bit now into what ADHD is. So there are 3 core traits of ADHD, which include hyperactivity, inattention, and impulsivity. And I'm going to talk about those in a minute. So if you're thinking, crikey, what does that mean? Don't panic. To gain a diagnosis, a child doesn't have to have all 3 of these traits. And again, I'm going to go far more into the diagnostics in a minute. It's really important to note, though, that actually you're in the tricky bit, because children in early years display a lot of traits similar to ADHD. But what you're looking for is that child where these traits are more frequent and to a greater degree. So all children interrupt, all children shout out, all children, jump off something that may not be wise. But you're looking for the children that do it more often than their peers and to a greater degree. So in young children, what do these 3 traits look like? So for your hyperactivity trait, you're looking for children who have boundless energy. They are running on a motor. They're the Duracell bunny. They're constantly on the go. They have trouble sleeping. They're incredibly talkative and vocal. They struggle to sit still. Okay, so they're these always on the go children. Everything's going all the time. Your impulsivity children are the ones who may behave before thinking. Play is very short. So play might be, oh, a thing, oh, another thing, oh, another interesting thing, oh, another thing. And they're going between lots of different things without really ever completing something. They have reduced risk awareness. They're not always really very aware of their surroundings or the dangers around them. And they're your climbers. They're the ones who are climbing a lot. Your inattentive trait is where you're having to repeat the child's name a lot. They may forget skills that they've learned. So they may be able to do a button one day, and then the next day it feels like you're teaching them from scratch again. And then the next day you're teaching them from scratch again. It's that trouble retaining things. They have trouble following instructions, and they can also be quite inconsistent with their routine as well. Now, alongside this, some children might experience sensory challenges as well, where they become quite easily overwhelmed, and then they find it quite difficult to regulate how they respond to whatever they're doing. Now, I want to delve a bit deeper into the diagnostics, because actually our early years colleagues have a really important part to play in helping a child in the diagnosis of ADHD. So the DSM-5 is it's a very fancy title, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So this is basically the diagnostic criteria for your ADHD, your ASD, all of those things that are concerned less with a physical side of things and more a neurological side of things. And I want to take you through the diagnostics for ADHD, just to make, I think seeing these actually helps me to understand a little bit more about what we're looking for. So this is the big page for the criteria for ADHD, and I've split it into parts so we can look at it bit by bit. Now, we're looking for symptoms or behaviours that have persisted for more than 6 months in more than 2 settings. And I'll focus on that in a mo. So these symptoms need to negatively impact on their academic or social or occupational function. Now, for patients aged under 16, so our children, they need to have more than 6 symptoms. Okay. And for those who are more adult, it is 5 symptoms. So we're looking at things for your inattentive kids who they display poor listening skills. They might lose things or misplace things that are really important. They're going to get sidetracked quite quickly by anything that happens. So I'm trying not to talk about my daughter too much because that's coming at the end. But very much she will be, if an aeroplane flies past outside, she'll be sidetracked by that and will lose any attention that she did have on an activity. They might forget daily activities. So these are the children where you're having to remind them every day to do things that other children just know that they have to do because they do it on the daily. Attention span is short. And again, this isn't for your littlies, but it is for the slightly older ones. So lacking ability to complete schoolwork or to follow instructions. They find it hard to get started on these things as well. And also you'll see thoughtless mistakes in schoolwork when they're a little bit older as well. So certainly these first sort of 5 you can be looking for in your children in setting. So for your hyperactive and impulsive children, you're looking at your fidgeters. And it can just be like small fidgeting, like moving with the hands. Something like this is a classic ADHD where you're just kind of playing with your hands all the time. Restlessness that you can't control. As we've said, driven by a motor, that Duracell bunny. Finding it hard to play quietly. Finding it hard to stay seated, over talkative, difficulty waiting their turn, interrupting and intruding. So again, from a personal perspective, we've had it where little sister has kind of cut their knee. I'm trying to patch them up, trying to calm them down. And other daughters going, can I have a snack? Can I have a biscuit? So it's kind of that not reading the room and putting our needs first and interrupting something that can be quite, quite a big situation and not really knowing how to inhibit ourselves not to do that. Maybe impulsively blurting out answers before, you've even finished asking the question. So I found these diagnostic criteria quite useful to kind of hone me into what I'm looking at in a child when I'm thinking about whether they've got ADHD. The other thing that you need to have in place for a diagnosis to be made is that these symptoms need to have presented before they were 12. And it also needs to be in the absence of something else that could be causing them. Okay. So I think this is what people think ADHD looks like. It's the classic, throwing chairs in the setting and acting out and being boisterous and uncontrollable. And I found this really nice visual. So what people think ADHD is, so unable to sit still, talks too much. That's really what the majority of people think ADHD is. Whereas actually, it's a lot more multifaceted than that. In the same way that we've talked about this with autism as well. So, you've got fidgeting, scattered, and that's in terms of scattered thinking, scattered presentation. Everything's just happening in a kind of scattered way. Forgetful, they can become really withdrawn as well, actually. Very frustrated by things that we would say are simple. Very low threshold for frustration. Low tolerance for stress, very, very emotional. Poor emotional regulation. We're sort of 0 to 100 in a heartbeat. Very sensitive to criticism. And actually, when you think about that statement that I made at the start with a child hearing 20,000 more negative comments than their peers, if you add the fact that they are sensitive to that criticism, it's an incredibly damaging notion. And we really have to think about how we feed back to these children. Messy. I'll tell you this now, a kid with ADHD, their bedroom is an absolute tip. No matter how many times you tidy it, give it an hour and it's gone again. They're disorganized. They speak out of turn, struggle to finish things on time. And do you know what? It is tiring having ADHD. They work so hard to try to conform. These children are so tired by the end of the day, so tired by trying to hold everything in when actually all they want to do is be going and going and going and going and going, particularly when they get into school and it's a more conformed environment. And then the irony is they can't get to sleep because they're thinking about everything. So it's a terribly vicious cycle. Very hard time saying no, and also find it very hard making decisions. So things that are lovely, like going to the shop and choosing a toy for a treat, or going to a shop and choosing a cake from the bakery, if there are too many options, we get what's called decision paralysis, where a child literally is overwhelmed by this decision, and it normally ends up in a terrible overwhelm. And this lovely thing that us as parents go, oh, we'll go to the shop and buy a treat, actually turns into high stress, high emotion, and quite a negative experience. So ADHD is so much more than people think it is. So in toddlers, what can this look like? Really, really, what is this going to look like in your setting? So restlessness and fidgeting, and I've put a picture there of a little girl hair twiddling. Again, people think that the restlessness and the fidgeting is getting up and moving around. It's not. It can be quite little movements. Things like this, things like, if you can see me on the screen, just kind of running our hair over our face, something like that. Very tiny movements. Losing interest in activities after a couple of minutes. So again, for us, it wasn't really until child number 2 came along and sat doing pegboard puzzles, and actually did a pegboard puzzle to the end, where we thought, oh, hang on a minute, that's not happened before. We get about, 2 or 3 things into a pegboard, and then off we go. They talk and interrupt more than their peers, and that's what you need to keep in your mind. It's got to be more than their peers. Extraneous noises. So very often ADHD kiddos will go around sort of squawking or quacking or just making crazy noises, because again, it's some other thing to do, some other thing to occupy part of our body. They'll climb when instructed not to. This is an odd one, but the research is there. Can't hop on one foot by the age of 4. It's in all the books. A lot of injuries due to running or moving too fast when they're asked not to, or not being aware of their surroundings. Warming up too quickly to strangers. Okay, so obviously that's got a real safeguarding issue there. Fearlessness, driven by a motor, and forgetful in daily activities. Okay. So why is this tricky? This is tricky because it can look like all toddlers and preschoolers, but what you're looking for is the one that's a little bit extra, the kid who's a little bit more than the others. They're the ones that you're going to be looking for. And I meant to change a couple of words on this slide, but I didn't get around to it. I want to put, so what is one of your biggest responsibilities as an early years professional? So alongside supporting these children, which we're going to talk about in a bit, one of the biggest things that you can do for these children is gather evidence. And this is absolutely key. It's you persisted for more than 6 months in more than 2 settings. So my evidence of things that had happened in nursery and preschool were absolutely key when it came to the time where we had a diagnosis for my daughter. Because what a pediatrician is looking for is that the symptoms or the presentation are pervasive. So they have always been with that child for as long as we could identify them, and they have been in different environments, and they will be asking the parents, where do we see these happen? If it's only at home or if it's only at school, that's not enough. It needs to be in a range of different settings, and it needs to have been for a long time. So your evidence that you gather, your notes that you make, and your observations that you feed back will be key. You do not have to mention ADHD in any of these. Parents may not come on board to this until a child is 6 or 7 or 8. But what they'll do at that point is start to look back. And if they've got the evidence that you gathered as their early years professional, that will be absolutely invaluable. So gather the information. You don't have to tell anybody what your agenda is, but just note it down for if it ever comes to anything. Okay, but you're here to think about supporting these children in settings. So I've got a child who I think might have ADHD. What can I do? What does that look like? And remember as well, you don't have to have a diagnosis to be able to help these children. And a lot of the things in here you are going to realise will help all children anyway. So you may as well be doing a lot of them. So you know me by now, I'm not up for reinventing the wheel. So I've taken this beautiful, beautiful slide from a lovely website. So create structure. So much like our children with ASD and other neurodivergent conditions, children with ADHD really thrive on routine and predictability. So daily schedules and sticking to it are really, really useful. Make instructions clear and concise. So your children are not going to be able to focus on a very long instruction. So break them down into small, manageable chunks and give plenty of time for them to complete each part of that task. Frequent feedback, lots of positive behaviors. Instead of telling them off when they're engaging in something that you don't want to happen in setting, redirect instead. Okay. Opportunities for movement are absolutely key, as you can imagine. And I've got a slide on that coming up. Sensory friendly environment. So ADHD kiddos are often actually very sensitive to sensory input. So you need to keep everything as calm as you can, trying to avoid bright lights, avoid strong smells. So try and avoid cooking your curry that you're going to have for dinner, you know, over lunch while the kids are napping. Avoid loud noises where you can. I think a lot of people think that children with ADHD are desperate for more, desperate for more, desperate for more, that they've got enough going on in their heads actually, and what they're desperate for is a lot less. So try and keep it as calm as you can. Collaborate with the parents. Okay, so again, you don't have to mention ADHD if you don't feel comfortable to do that, but by all means talk about strategies, communicate regularly, keep them updated. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds to me like things that would benefit children with ASD, children with speech and language communication needs. Pretty much all children will benefit from all of these things anyway. So as well as this, the other things that you can do are use visual cues. So give them something to refer back to. So, you know, if you're teaching, I don't know, good hand washing or something, and there's a poster you can have by the sink to remind them of the steps, then that's really, really helpful. Provide lots of breaks. Okay, so moving breaks, listening breaks, all sorts of breaks. Break up that day. Again, lots of positive reinforcement, lots of patience. So these children are not trying to be difficult, and it can look like they are. I'll be honest, it can look like they are. So particularly when you get into sort of reading, writing, mark making, early numbers, it very often looks like they're just sort of not thinking or not concentrating or not trying their best. They're not trying to you know, hack you off. They're just really struggling. Educate yourselves and others. So the more people who understand it, the better. And also support research as well, because the more we know about it, the better we'll be able to treat kiddos and give them strategies. Exercise is massive for ADHD children. So research demonstrates that exercise has a similar effect to that provided by the most popular ADHD medication. So it stimulates the production of dopamine and norepinephrine. I've been trying to say that all day and I still can't. But these are two key things that are not produced enough in the ADHD brain, and exercise can do that. And it's been shown that the more complex the movements, the better, because actually you're stimulating more areas of the brain. So actually things like martial arts, skateboarding, rock climbing, not that you'll be doing those in setting, but you can always point your parents to it. So like you might have a local clip and climb that do like top sessions, ballet, gymnastics, all of those things that are getting lots and lots of big movements in, and movements in patterns that are engaging the brain are all especially good. So what can that look like in your setting? Balance bikes are brilliant. Balance bikes get all sorts of things working. Obstacle courses, they're fabulous. And things like tumble tots are brilliant for kids with ADHD. So trim trails, so you're kind of balancing, and then also sensory circuits. Anything like that where you're trying to engage the brain as well as the body. So running is great. If all you can offer an ADHD child is a running break, fine. But if you can offer them something extra that gets the brain thinking as well, then you're going to be much, much better off and give these children a lot more bang for their movement break buck. So obviously, as a speech and language therapist, I couldn't do a presentation without talking about speech and language. So some areas of speech and language can be affected in children with ADHD. Now, most of them can talk and they can have a conversation, and they won't always look like your children who've got speech and language and communication needs. However, when you drill down, there are very often some things going on underneath that you don't necessarily, see. But it all comes down to something called executive functioning. And this is one of the major areas that children with ADHD struggle with. And there are 8 core points in executive functioning. So working memory, so keeping something in your head while you're also using it. This is so hard for children with ADHD. So for example, I'm thinking school age because that's all I've got at the moment in my head, but it may be that they're set a little grammar exercise going to find all of the adjectives in this paragraph. And then they get 2 or 3 lines down. They're like, what am I supposed to be doing? Because it's holding the task in their head while doing the task is too much. Self-monitoring. So self-awareness to how you're doing at the moment. They can't monitor themselves particularly well. Planning and prioritizing. So thinking ahead. Taking initiation or taking action to get started on things is tricky. Organization. So keeping track on things physically and mentally. So that can affect things like self-care, but it can also just affect things like sort of getting ready for school. Impulse control, so that thinking before acting. Emotional control, and then your flexible thinking, so adjusting your behavior when things change unexpectedly. And all of these things feed into speech and language in different ways. So this difficulty across those executive functions can have a knock-on effect on social communication. So if you've got trouble paying attention, you're not going to pick up on social cues in the same way that other children do. And we've talked about that before as an issue for children with speech and language and communication needs, because they can't access the language, they can't always access what's going on. And so they miss social cues. And children with ADHD are no different. Narrative skills. Now, this is a biggie. So it can be really hard for children with ADHD to tell a story coherently. It's hard for them to stay on topic, and it's hard for them to give enough background information. So the amount of times my child has started to tell me a story, but they've started kind of halfway through, and I've got no idea what we're talking about, where it's set, or who the people are in it. And I've had to go backtrack. I don't know what you're talking about. So, they can be halfway through the story in their head before they kind of start telling it. Okay, so vocabulary. So if you're struggling to keep up with the pace of information coming in, you might miss new pieces of vocabulary. These gaps form quickly, and over time they are harder to fill in. And my daughter's vocabulary level is 2 or 3 years behind what it should be. And we've had to work really hard to plug that gap. And again, we know that vocabulary level entering school is a direct kind of indicator of their year 11 outcomes. So vocabulary is absolutely key. And again, it's one of those things that people don't really think about. But children with ADHD, if you listen carefully, they're very often using words like it's stuff or something that sounds a little bit like, you know, what you're talking about. So they might call a stethoscope like a heartbeaty thing. So it kind of describes what it is, but they sometimes miss the vocabulary, but they're so clever at describing it that you don't always notice. But actually, there can be some big gaps there. Word retrieval skills. Oh, yeah. So this kind of goes into what I've just talked about. So they have trouble finding the words because that vocabulary system is impaired. They find it hard to find the words. So you definitely see a lot more generic words coming through. Grammar is tricky as well. It can take a lot longer to use and understand the rules of the language consistently. So there are quite big knock-on effects to ADHD on speech and language. But I think because these children can talk and have a conversation, it's very often overlooked. So what can we do about this? We can support vocabulary, label. So don't assume that the child knows the word, or even if they've said it once or twice, it's always better to reinforce, because the more times they hear it, the more it's going to be primed in their brain and the more easy it is for them to find it. Keep your instructions short, chunk them down. Make sure your child has your attention before giving instructions. Otherwise, you're going to be talking to a brick wall. Give the child listening breaks if you've been doing a lot of listening. So if you've been doing a circle time and maybe reading a book and they've got through the whole book, give them a chance to go and do something else afterwards, because they'll have had to work really, really hard to sit still and listen to that book. Have a quiet space to go to so that the child can decompress. Learn, if you can, to recognize when the child is becoming dysregulated or overwhelmed. Some children go up and up and up, and other children actually become a lot more introverted, and that's certainly what I saw in my child. Support the child in learning to tell or retell stories. So as we said before, it's quite hard for children to tell stories in a kind of coherent way. So this is where sequencing activities can become really helpful, particularly where maybe you're sequencing, taking pictures of something that they've been doing and they're sequencing themselves to support their retell. Lots and lots of positive reinforcement. So remember that quote from the start and gather your evidence. So it's going to be key when it becomes time to diagnose. Even if you don't get results right now, you're going to be such an important part of the picture. Okay. So coming up next month in February, we're going to be talking about EAL because lots and lots of you have requested it. So we're going to talk about myths and facts and how to support EAL children in your setting. So we're going to stop recording now.